Welcome everyone to my second video. Today, we're going to take a look at what is epilepsy. Epilepsy is a neurological disorder that people can get. What is epilepsy exactly? Well, epilepsy is when the neurons fire all at the same time. In epilepsy, it's usually caused by something congenital. So like, if it has something to do with the pregnancy is one thing. Another thing is epilepsy is also caused by a chemical imbalancement in the brain. What do I mean by chemical imbalancement? Well, let's put it this way. Seizures are usually caused by many different things. It could be alcohol related or drug related. It could also be from a birth trauma. So like if something goes wrong during the pregnancy, is what I meant to say. If something goes wrong with the pregnancy where, let's say for example, the mother has a history of having seizures, that could be passed on genetically to the baby. Now, a baby's brain isn't fully developed until they're the age of 25. What will happen is, in that time, it could be that child could get epilepsy. Epilepsy is basically a state of convulsions that lasts a certain time. So for example, if you were to have a seizure and stop and then have another seizure, well, if you were to do seizure after seizure after seizure, that could be because of a birth trauma. That could also be because of the genetic material passed down through the mother's placenta to the baby. In other words, sometimes it could also be like congenital. It can be congenital if you got a sibling that had epilepsy and you had gotten epilepsy. Well, they do have some testing that they can do. They can do blood work and a seizure history on both you and that sibling, where they can cross-match the genetic material and see if there is epilepsy in you and the sibling. I'm not a neurologist, but I do know some things about neurology. For example, one part of neurology is trauma. When you think of trauma neurologically, I think of stuff like car accidents, burns, stuff like that. And that's another part of the seizures, is it could be because of blunt force trauma. Blunt force as in when you go and hit your head really hard, your brain bounces off your skull, and that can really damage your brain, where a part of the brain dies, where then a certain chemical will go imbalanced with another chemical, and then you could get like blunt force trauma kind of seizures. Those seizures, there's also seizures like focal seizures, drop seizure, and stuff like that. A drop seizure is basically a seizure that happens in a blink of an eye and you're on the floor, ending up with a big thunk. Seizures aren't always caused by alcohol or drugs, but also they're not necessarily about trauma, neither. Sometimes it's not just when you're born, sometimes it's related to another illness. So for example, if you had a problem with your heart, for example, and there's a lack of oxygen to the brain, we all know the circulatory system carries oxygen to the brain. Sometimes what can happen is you can get a pulmonary embolism that could break off and go to the brain and cause a stroke. Sometimes in the elderly people you can see not necessarily epilepsy, but you can see more like stroke, heart attack, stuff like that. That kind of stuff though is related to medical field, and that's what this second video is about. It's about understanding the medical field. There are different medications for epilepsy. The one that is the most recent one is Depakine. Depakine is a neurorelaxant where it will basically shut off the nerves that are firing really fast to a more relaxed state where it's going to be more like a normal rhythm. So it's kind of like your heart. If your heart is in a tachycardia, which is too fast, or on the other side, or on a different spectrum, if your heart is too slow, that's also known as bradycardia. There's also VFAB, or ventricular, there's VTAC, there's VFib. VFib is ventricular fibrillation, and there's also V-flutter, or ventricular flutter, when your heart is just sitting there fluttering, like a butterfly kind of thing. How you can relate the heart to the brain is your brain's a computer. Your heart is the engine, and your head is the computer. So it's actually kind of like a vehicle. Your head controls all of its functions. One of the functions is the engine. The blood is the oil. When the oil is really cold, so when your blood is tacky, and I don't mean fast, what I mean by tacky is like really sticky, that's because your core temperature is dropped too low. And on the other side, if your body gets too hot, then our radiator, or in this case, we would sweat as perspiration, and basically what would happen is neither are good. So if there's an imbalancement with the heart, after the imbalancement in the heart, there will be an imbalancement in the brain. So for example, if we're talking pulmonary embolism, a pulmonary embolism could become a stroke in other people. It's not necessarily, there's a rare cardio condition called WPW, or Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome is basically a cardioelectrical deficiency where the heart's electricity doesn't work as properly. So that's kind of like when there's that electrical deficiency in the heart, that will shut down one part of the brain. All depending on which hemisphere of the brain. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And then we have a front hemisphere and a rear hemisphere. In this case, now we're talking more about how the brain communicates with the heart. For example, our blood goes throughout our body. So when you cut yourself, there are these things called coagulates. And coagulants create clots, but it's not necessarily how a clot forms. Our body produces this thing called vitamin K. Vitamin K helps to clot the blood, helps to make the blood clot. So for example, you cut yourself with a knife. The best way to explain this would be a nosebleed, for example. After you have a nosebleed, it gets dry. That's a blood clot forming. That's the vitamin K and the coagulants coagulating the blood. Now, to go back to a pulmonary embolism, it's the same thing, but instead it's in the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery is one of the main arteries that carries the blood to your body. And this is the second video. Hope you enjoy. Hit the like button, and also please leave a comment. Merry Christmas.